Hi, and welcome to Unplanned, the show about cities and how they work. I'm Sam, your host. Today, we are going to dig into a fascinating person in urban planning and architecture, and actually in computer science, a man named Christopher Alexander. And to help us understand who he was and what his importance was, he died recently, we are joined by Brent Ryan, who is a professor of urban planning,
urban design, and public policy at MIT.
There you have it. Brent, welcome to Unplanned.
Thank you, Sam.
And thanks for joining us to talk about this very interesting guy, Christopher Alexander, who you have done certainly plenty of thinking about over time. Why don't you give us a little introduction to who he was, and then let's dig into what he means or meant to the field of urban planning, architecture, computer science, etc.
Okay.
So why don't you just dig us right into it, and then we'll go from there.
Well, Christopher Alexander was born in the UK, and originally he studied mathematics, but also architecture, as I understand it. He became influential really in the 1960s with a short book called The City Is Not a Tree that was hugely influential. It was one of a variety of things coming out in the 60s that was essentially constructing a critique of modernism, what we might call high modernism. We still see its effects to this day. This was the idea that you could, in essence, completely design a city, solve every problem through top-down reshaping of the built environment. And Alexander had a problem with that. He wasn't alone. Jane Jacobs was not a fan of this approach either. Many other thinkers at the time, Bernard Rudolphsky, Gordon Cullen, other thinkers who maybe faded away a little bit, but they weren't too favorable toward this approach either. But Alexander really, probably because of his mathematical training and his position as an architect, constructed the most well-rounded, complete, and voluminous critique of this idea. He, in essence, continued publishing almost to the end of his life. He also built several works that represented his ideas.
Well, you're going to be our guide to all of this, because anybody who studies or even approaches the field of architecture, urban planning, runs into his work at some level, and I certainly did, but not at the depth that I think you've thought about it. One of the books that everybody gets, and we were joking earlier, is the book that they wanted everybody to buy, was A Pattern Language. Mm-hmm. That's probably his most famous work. Is that the work you'd want to start with as we begin to dig into what he was all about? And maybe before we do that, I'll just add a little bit more biography. Born in 1936 in Vienna, Austria, Alexander was raised there, but was not raised there, left 2 years later to England because of the Nazi takeover. Lived in England, went to Trinity College, Cambridge, and then came right here to Cambridge, Massachusetts, first to Harvard and then MIT in the late 50s, and then spent many years out of the University of California, Berkeley, where he taught.
Yes, he was a professor of architecture there until he became emeritus. Yeah. And constructed what he called the Center for Environmental Structure at Berkeley, which was a kind of a laboratory with many adherents to his thought.
Right. So I'm going to be a little bit the guru sitting on top of his.
Well, the pattern language is a manifesto,
right,
and puts itself out there as one.
Right.
And there are many who, having read the pattern language as Alexander intended them to, feel that they have discovered a kind of foundational truth. And the analogy to religion is direct, and they follow it in that direction.
Well, let's dig into it then. Let's look at that book. He has some others that are famous. A Timeless Way of Building, is that the correct?
It's a kind of companion to the pattern language. Mm-hmm.
But let's start with the pattern language, because that is the one that's most well known. What can you tell us about that? You're starting to tell us a little bit about it. What is it about that book that made it so impactful for people?
It's simultaneously simple, but behind it enormously complex. It is in essence a kind of lexicon of a belief system, if that makes sense. You can open the pattern language at any page. It's about 330 or so patterns. I probably have the number wrong, but it's somewhere in the multiple hundreds, 280, 320, something like that. And you can just read one, or you can read it cover to cover. You can read it backwards, forwards, in any direction. But I think that the average person who reads the pattern language will find things that say things that are so simple but so profound, like a room should have windows on two sides, or every community should have a gathering place, or create a special place in your home. And then he provides maybe 500 words of text, usually a very well chosen image. He's a very visual person. So unlike Jane Jacobs, who refused to provide any images in her books and said, look around, Alexander says, no, most of what you see is not where you should be going. Let me show you good examples. And in that sense, he's a true designer. Designers operate through paradigms. An architect doesn't say, look at every house and find beauty. Alexander would say, no, look at the best examples. And the book was research. So these patterns that he called them ranged from the scale of a city, either a neighborhood, all the way down to the scale of a room. So there's many powerful ideas in that. One is that a lot of these ideas you can realize yourself. So if you want to improve your own home, you want to improve your room, your dorm room, your home, or you want to improve your neighborhood, just take some of the ideas. You don't even have to take them all. They operate independently of each other.
Well, let's take a minute
You see
there.
the power of these ideas.
Well, absolutely. So there's and what was the number you said? 300 plus possible
like
patterns.
that.
Here's the book we're actually talking about.
It is, let's see. I overcounted. 253, ending with things from your life.
So these are patterns. Now let's dig into this a little bit. So these are patterns that he and his research cohort, because to be fair, there are other names on the book jacket.
Mm-hmm.
He's the famous
Collaborators in the Center for Environmental Structure.
Who produced this book. Now, you describe it as research. Let's try to understand, how did he identify what an instance of a pattern,
Mm-hmm.
and then what made him choose that pattern over another possible pattern that you might see out in the world? How did he collect? How did he end up at 253 patterns?
That's a very good question. You have to remember that Alexander began as a mathematician. So when a city is not a tree, he proves mathematically that objects or elements within a set of relationships have certain relationships to each other. And those relationships can be either tree-like, in a sense linear, in which something within a subset is only connected back to the parent of that set, or they can exist in a lattice. That's a mathematical truth that he saw happening in the built environment, but he described it what we would call qualitatively. So he said, you, and you meaning you or anyone, that's you can look at your world and you will know when you're seeing true beauty. And beauty is truth, and there is truth in beauty, and the goal of the pattern language is to clarify those truths. And if you build those truths, you will achieve a truly beautiful world.
Well, I'm going to pull out a quote from The Timeless Way of Being, 1979 book, his 1979 book, which is quoted in the Wikipedia article about him, which opens with this sentence. This quote opens, "There is one timeless way of building. It is 1,000 years old and the same today as it has ever been. The great traditional buildings of the past, the villages and tents and temples in which man feels at home, have always been made by people who were very close to the center of this way." So
Yes.
I mean, that's quite a bold statement to say there is one timeless way of building.
Yes.
but it sounds very much along the lines of what you're describing right now.
Yes, who would not find true beauty in the Taj Mahal or in the Parthenon? And what Alexander was saying was this: you're not going to the Parthenon and finding it to be beautiful because you like ancient Greek ruins. There are a lot of them out there. There are a lot of Mughal tombs. These builders discovered and constructed a lattice, interwoven set of physical design principles, and they combined it in a collective way where they achieved the true beauty that's possible in design. And so you can find many of the patterns in these buildings. These are canonical buildings. By the same token, you can show that what you think of as an ugly building probably lacks most of those patterns. Now, that's a subjective, to some extent, conversation, but beauty is not really subjective. Everyone agrees the Taj Mahal is beautiful. Some people say it's the most beautiful building in the world. Some people say that clothing is beautiful, a person is beautiful. Instagram is filled with things that they get more likes. Why? Because people think they're more beautiful. We aspire to beauty. It's a goal. So Alexander's 253 patterns are the result of exhaustive investigation of multiple scales of aesthetic interrelationships and clarifying them. In other words, it's the reflections of the wise.
Now, we're going to just stay on this notion for a half a second longer,
Sure.
because the Parthenon and the Taj Mahal look very different from the outside, both in terms of their rectilinearity or their curvatures or whatever we might find. But it sounds as though it's a set of relationships that make them beautiful, regardless of their specific instances, whatever it is about them. They actually incorporate these relationships that Christopher Alexander, is noticing and is recording in his book. Is that a fair description of what he's arguing?
It is. In his later work, he talked about what he called centers and holes. And so he encouraged anyone to examine a photograph or to look at a plan, and you could start to draw whole circles that that existed with all of these different relationships that represented interwoven scales of complexity.
That's fascinating. Now let's go through some of the scales, because he's very well known at the kind of planning scale for sort of the village center. And it's interesting because New Urbanism is a sort of offshoot in some ways of his thought pattern. But let's spend a minute on the different scales that he looks at before we get into some of the ways in which people took these ideas and then ran with them.
They're clearly laid out in the pattern language. He describes them, let's see, Towns, Buildings, Construction is the subtitle of the book. The scale of towns, the scale of buildings, the scale of construction. So he would say there are three scales. Construction is maybe the sub-building level of design. That would be your dormitory room, my office. It could be part of your home. It could be an outdoor space, an outdoor garden that's added onto your home. Buildings would be a larger ensemble, maybe the Taj Mahal and its immediate surrounds. And then towns would be the entire web of human settlement that comprises whatever we perceive of as that settlement, whether that's a village, a town, a city, etc.
Now, in a pattern language, when I was flipping through it the other day to get ready for this discussion, I think he has a section on the village inn or the village inn meeting room. So it's this notion that there is a thing that is a meeting room that you encounter when you're traveling, and that's one of the patterns, I think, that he identifies. Help us understand what he's getting at, not just in that specific instance, but in this notion that our built world is in a sense a set of building blocks that we sort of fit together into different connections, I suppose.
Well, Alexander was acknowledging the reality that humans are a social species and that there are scales of human interaction that we find to be pleasurable. It's kind of what everyone missed when we were in Zoom rooms, like a group of friends sitting in the corner of a bar, or a classroom full of students, a village meeting, a baseball game. These are scales of human groupings that have spaces that support those groupings. I'd say Alexander was most seduced by some of the smaller scales. I don't recall him talking a lot about baseball stadiums. He would have been talking about football, soccer stadiums instead. But he was very captivated by places that could support positive human interaction. Maybe outdoor seating outside your house, maybe a room within your house, maybe a place within a room, in the same sense that Frank Lloyd Wright always said the fireplace is the center of the home. If you look at every single Frank Lloyd Wright house, he would design a gathering place around the hearth. He said the hearth is the heart of the home. It was traditionally when we depended on fire, but it remains so today. And we have some relationship to this. People still like to gather around a gas fireplace.
Well, let's spend a second on one of his offshoots, which is maybe unfair to sort of lump it on him, but this whole concept of new urbanism, which is, I would say, but you feel free to correct me, which sort of took off in the 80s into the 90s, and this notion that we've lost in that, again, maybe as a critique of modernism, is sort of we've lost that human scale, and there is a way to refine that. But it produced some interesting examples in, say, Florida and other places. I'm curious what your thoughts are about that, just that whole topic of Alexander, but also his relationship to this other phenomenon, new urbanism.
Well, in the book A New Theory of Urban Design, which came out in the late 1980s, 1987, and so this is 10 years after the pattern language, Alexander is providing additional clarifications about larger scale human settlement design, what we would call urban design, or we could call it city planning or town planning, whatever term we want to use. He described rules for growth that he said would generate highly satisfactory human settlements, the same kind of satisfactory settlements that Dwani and others before him and after him have argued are really the most satisfying, positive human environments. Alexander believed that by examining rules for growth and by constructing communities in a holistic way where those rules were followed as opposed to breaking them, which also implies a kind of incrementalism and a kind of corrective behavior, perhaps, correcting mistakes as you go along, you could achieve this highly satisfactory, beautiful place. The growth of larger wholes, positive urban space, formation of centers, piecemeal growth. These are some of the principles. They're laid out in more detail in the book. What's interesting about it is he carries out an example which takes up much of the book in San Francisco, like an empty piece of land in San Francisco, and says, let's try it out, right? We're going to create a demonstration. And Alexander, to his credit, always believed that these were not abstract rules. These were buildable. And you can and should build them. And he built several buildings that exemplified his principles. He wasn't simply looking at the past. He was saying, no, it's also the future.
Well, it's interesting. In this Wikipedia article about him, they mention, I believe it's the same project in San Francisco, where the rule was for the students, you can only follow the local laws. You can't go back to sort of master planning principles and impose your will on the space. You have to follow the very specific and directive laws that might exist in the zoning code, for example. And then out of that, my understanding anyway from my brief read of the Wikipedia was, out of that will come something that works at that human scale.
Yes, Alexander would say mostly that zoning and a lot of what we think of as contemporary standards were what we might call bunk, that they really detracted from the creation, in fact, may have forbidden the creation of satisfactory human environments. And Andres Dwani feels very similarly, and it's why New urbanism has shifted into essentially a set of regulatory strategies, the smart code and its descendants. Alexander wasn't that practical. He was a builder, he was an architect. He left code reform to others, people like Dwani, who in a sense have more patience and can engage in this process piecemeal. It's also piecemeal reform. What happened, though, was interesting when Alexander actually tried out his community. He said, it's beautiful, we succeeded, but it looks like in a medieval Italian village. And in that lies some of the critiques of Alexander's work, that it's really incompatible with not only the rapid scale with which we build, and to some extent have to build human settlements today, but that it romanticizes a certain period and pattern and form of design, which is the quaint medieval settlement, or you could say the Marblehead, Massachusetts type settlement, or maybe the Japanese temple. It wasn't that he was firmly fixed on European culture, although people have made Eurocentric critiques of the work. He was looking at examples available to him, in his time, the 70s.
Well, and that gets us into so many other conversations because, of course, I think modernism itself was a critique of that older way of
It certainly was.
And so then
where's the highway?
Right. And also this notion that I'm going to get this all wrong, but the form is the function. So you can...
we're building of steel.
Right.
We're building in concrete.
Right.
We can have light and air. We need light and air.
Right.
Where is that in a medieval Italian village?
Right. And
or in Philadelphia.
Right. And I think I read recently that when Gropius came to Harvard to teach, he wanted to get rid of the history of architecture as a course of study, just to say, we don't care. That's not what this is about anymore. This is, or never was, maybe. Which is
the radical break with the past that maybe modernism went too far.
Well, leaving that aside, because that, of course, is a whole other topic that we might get into at some point in the future, let's assess Alexander from our perspective now in 2022. He died in March of this year in England, and that's part of the reason for doing this episode of Unplanned. But help us understand, what does he mean to us today, and what does he mean to this next generation of urban planners, urban designers, people who are going to be grappling with all these issues?
It's a great question, and I'll tell you a small anecdote that once upon a time when I was a doctoral student at MIT, I asked one of the professors of architecture, a man named Julian Beinart, who taught a course called Theory of City Form. I said, Julian, how important is Alexander really? And Julian Beinart said he was probably the most profound thinker in architecture, and that has made architects extremely uncomfortable with him. And the reality is that by the time of Alexander's departure, his work is very little discussed in architecture, in formal architecture schools. I would say students mostly don't know about his work. I would say many practicing architects would regard themselves as uncomfortable with it. And we have to ask ourselves, how is it that we can look at a book where each individual element seems to make so much sense, where principles of human comfort are obviously critical, where a benevolent relationship with heritage and the past is something that we increasingly recognize as important, where community participation is held up as a mantra in urban planning? How is it that we can find the work of someone like Christopher Alexander to be marginal? I find that troubling. It says something about the state of the architecture and design professions, that we can't reconcile Alexander's thinking with the other critical mission of moving the field forward and of constructing contemporary, I don't want to say modern, but let's say contemporary design that allows us to utilize things like technology that accommodates building codes for the disabled, the visually impaired. How do we provide all of those mandates, but also the mandate to utilize the technology we have to do the things we know how to do, like building a building that's 100 stories high? How do we reconcile that with the humanity Alexander's calling us to build in a humane way? I think we would all say that's important. and yet somehow we don't refer to his work on a daily basis, and that's a very interesting paradox.
Well, Brent Ryan, I want to thank you for helping us at least just scratch the surface of this guy who was very impactful. I remember before I even thought about urban planning for myself as a sort of area of interest, being introduced to his work. And it does have that sort of powerful, almost like a bell ringing that resonates somehow deeply within you, and you get it. Even if you don't have a sort of a background in it, it makes sense. And there's a sort of power to the argument by its simplicity in a way.
Yeah, there's a humbleness to the work. It's intended for you to learn as much or as little as you want, in the same way that Jane Jacobs is. But I think Alexander has many, many more lessons for designers than someone like Jacobs. And I think Alexander will have his day again. The work is not going to diminish because many of the so-called truths, and he may have gone too far in claiming that he had discovered truth as others have before him. These truths will return as areas that designers think about, and we'll see when that occurs.
Well, thank you for joining us on unPlanned. Let's get you back on for some other topic.
My pleasure, Sam. Thank you.